Most people imagine a serial killer looks different, that they move differently, that something in their eyes gives it away, that if you sat across from one at a dinner table, you would know. You wouldn't. Dennis Rader spent 30 years as a church president, a compliance officer, and a family man. He coached his son's Boy Scout troop. He enforced local codes about untrimmed grass and unleashed dogs. He also bound, tortured, and murdered 10 people. And nobody, not his wife of 34 years, not his children, not his colleagues, had any idea. So the question isn't what kind of monster does this? The real question, the one forensic psychology has been trying to answer for 50 years, is how does a person like that become what they become? Today we're going to find out. This channel goes beyond the crime to explain the psychology behind it. If that's what you're here for, subscribe. New documentary every week. Now, let's talk about what science actually knows about the making of a killer. For most of human history, we explained killers the same way we explained everything we didn't understand. Evil, possession, madness, something supernatural that chose a person and twisted them. In the 20th century, we updated the language but kept the same idea. We called them monsters, psychopaths, born that way, broken from birth. It was a comfortable explanation. If killers are born, not made, then no system failed, no parent failed, no school, no community, no institution. Just a bad gene that produced a bad person. The problem is that the science doesn't support this. Not even close. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the team that essentially invented criminal profiling, spent decades interviewing incarcerated serial killers. The conclusions they reached changed everything we thought we knew. The finding was blunt. There is no single profile. There is no universal childhood. There is no gene, but there are patterns. And those patterns, almost without exception, involve one thing: trauma. In the 1970s, psychiatrists began identifying what became known as the McDonald triad. 3 childhood behaviors observed disproportionately in violent adults: persistent bedwetting past the age of 12, fire setting, animal cruelty. Now, in the triad alone has been heavily critiqued by later research. These behaviors appear in many children who never go on to commit violence. But what the triad represented, a framework for understanding how early trauma expresses itself, opened the door to deeper research. What that research found was more disturbing than a single trait. It was a pattern of compounding failures. Forensic psychologist Robert Hare, who spent his career developing the psychopathy checklist, still the most widely used diagnostic tool for psychopathy today, described what he called the broken attachment model. Attachment, the bond a child forms with a caregiver in their first 3 years of life, is one of the most critical developmental processes that exists. When that bond fails, through neglect, abuse, abandonment, or severe inconsistency, the developing brain literally rewires itself. The amygdala, the part of your brain that processes fear and emotional response, becomes dysregulated. The prefrontal cortex, which controls impulse regulation and empathy, develops differently. This is not metaphor. This is neuroscience. But here's where it becomes more complicated. Millions of children experience severe trauma and never harm anyone. The vast majority don't. So trauma alone is not the answer. What researchers identified were 3 factors that, in combination, dramatically increase the probability of violent behavior in adulthood. Factor 1, biological vulnerability. Some individuals are born with neurological traits that make them more susceptible to the effects of trauma. Lower baseline anxiety, reduced emotional responsiveness, a nervous system that doesn't signal distress the way most people's does. This is not the born evil myth. This is a biological predisposition that on its own produces nothing, but which, combined with the right environmental triggers, creates a very dangerous profile. Factor 2, a traumatic environment. Abuse, physical, sexual, psychological. Neglect, witnessing violence. An early environment that teaches the child that other people are threats, that control is the only safety, and that pain is something that happens to you, or something you do to others. Factor 3, social failure. The absence of any corrective relationship. No teacher who saw something and intervened. No counselor, no mentor, no one who offered an alternative framework for understanding the world. It is this third factor that researchers increasingly believe is the variable that matters most. Because the evidence shows us, again and again, that one relationship, one adult who genuinely saw a troubled child and responded, can interrupt the trajectory. When all three factors align, biology, trauma, and social isolation, what emerges is something researchers describe as callous unemotional traits, the clinical term for what most people would call an inability to feel empathy, remorse, or guilt. There is one element that almost every serious study of serial killers returns to: fantasy. The FBI's landmark interviews with 36 convicted serial killers, including Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Edmund Kemper, found that virtually all of them had developed rich, detailed violent fantasies years, sometimes decades, before their first crime. This is not incidental. It is central. For someone who has experienced severe trauma, who has developed callous, unemotional traits, who has no meaningful social attachments, fantasy serves a function. It is a space of total control, total power. In a life that has felt powerless, the inner world becomes the only place where the person is not a victim. Ted Bundy described this explicitly in his final interview, hours before his execution. He talked about the slow escalation of fantasy, starting with violent images, moving to increasingly specific scenarios, feeding a psychological need he described as insatiable. What the fantasy does over time is desensitize. Each time the fantasy is rehearsed, the emotional response dulls slightly. The act that once felt transgressive in imagination begins to feel, to the distorted psychology, almost ordinary. Forensic psychologists call this the graduation model. The fantasy doesn't stay static. It escalates. It becomes more specific, more elaborate, more violent. And at some point, triggered by stress, by opportunity, by a specific circumstance that mirrors the fantasy, the line between imagination and action collapses. This is why serial killers kill serially. Not because each crime satisfies, but because none of them do. The pattern that emerges when you study the childhoods of serial killers is not a mystery. It is a failure of systems. John Wayne Gacy's father was a violent alcoholic who regularly humiliated and physically assaulted him. His school never reported it. No intervention was ever made. Jeffrey Dahmer's parents were in the middle of a bitter, hostile divorce at the exact moment his pathology was crystallizing. He described feeling invisible. He was. Dennis Rader described years of disturbing fantasies he told no one about. Not because the resources weren't available, but because the culture around him had no framework for a child to say, "Something is wrong with how I think." This is not about excusing. It is about understanding. Because understanding is the only path to prevention. The research is unambiguous. Early intervention works. Children with callous, unemotional traits who receive consistent, warm, responsive parenting, even from a non-biological caregiver, show significant improvement in empathy, impulse control, and social functioning. The monster isn't born. It is produced by trauma that goes unaddressed, by systems that fail to see, by a culture that would rather believe in the randomness of evil than confront the uncomfortable reality that most of the worst things that happen in the world are the delayed consequences of the worst things we allowed to happen to children. I want to be precise about what the science does and doesn't say. It does not say that trauma inevitably produces violence. The overwhelming majority of people who experience severe childhood trauma never harm another person. What it says is that the specific combination, biological vulnerability, environmental trauma, and social isolation, without intervention, creates a profile that dramatically elevates risk. Dr. James Fallon, a neuroscientist who discovered, during a family research project, that his own brain scan matched the pattern of psychopathy, has spent years arguing that the field needs to move past the binary of born versus made. His framing: it is always both. Biology sets the potential. Environment pulls the trigger. That framing should disturb us, because it means that between the biology we can't control and the outcomes we find incomprehensible sits something we can influence. The environment we build for children, the systems we fund or defund, the teachers we train or don't, the therapy we provide or deny. The monster isn't inevitable. It is the product of specific, traceable, preventable failures. In the next video on this channel, we go inside the psychology of cults, how highly intelligent, rational people get recruited, controlled, and destroyed by groups that use the exact same psychological mechanisms we just described. It is one of the most disturbing videos I have made. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and leave a comment. I read every single one. The question I want you to think about, and tell me your answer below. Do you believe prevention is possible? Or is this a problem we have already accepted we cannot solve? I'll see you in the next one.